The first time Lilah Hayes saw the silhouette of a man collapsed on the rocky shore below her lighthouse, she knew the storm had claimed another victim. What she didn't know was that this particular victim would change her life forever. The relentless rain pounded against the glass of the Bentonville Lighthouse in 1878, situated on the rugged Oregon coastline. At 26, Lilah had been tending this lighthouse alone for nearly 3 years, ever since her father's passing left her as the sole keeper of the flame. The lighthouse stood sentinel on a jagged promontory overlooking the treacherous Pacific waters that had claimed countless ships and souls over the decades. Lilah pressed her face against the cold glass of the lantern room, squinting through the sheets of rain. The figure hadn't moved in the minutes since she'd spotted him. With a heavy sigh, she wrapped her woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders and began the descent down the spiral staircase. The wooden steps creaked beneath her boots as she made her way to the bottom, the howling wind growing louder as she approached the door. She paused only to grab the medical kit her father had assembled years ago, and a lantern, before pushing open the heavy oak door. The wind nearly ripped it from her grasp as she stepped outside, the force of the gale threatening to knock her off her feet. Lilah ducked her head and pressed forward, following the narrow path that wound down to the shore. By the time she reached the unconscious man, her dress was soaked through, and her hair plastered to her face. She knelt beside him on the wet sand, setting her lantern down carefully. Rolling him over, she was surprised to find him still breathing, though his face was pale and a nasty gash crossed his forehead. He was dressed unlike most sailors who washed ashore. He wore the garb of a cowboy, complete with worn leather chaps and boots with spurs. A peculiar sight on the Oregon coast. "Sir, can you hear me?" she shouted over the roaring storm, patting his cheek firmly. His eyelids fluttered, then opened to reveal eyes the color of a summer sky, though clouded with confusion and pain. "Am I dead?" he rasped. "Not yet," Lilah replied, already examining the wound on his head. "But you might be if we don't get you inside soon. Can you stand?" The man attempted to rise but fell back with a groan. "Give me a moment." Lilah frowned. The tide was coming in fast, and the rocky beach would soon be underwater. "We don't have a moment. The sea will claim this spot within minutes." With determination born of years of self-reliance, Lilah managed to help the stranger to his feet. He was tall, at least 6 inches taller than her own 5'4" frame, and solidly built. He leaned heavily against her as they made their slow, stumbling way up the path to the lighthouse. By the time they reached the door, Lilah was nearly carrying him, her muscles screaming in protest. Once inside, she guided him to the small sitting area near the hearth where a fire still burned low. He collapsed into her father's old chair, his head lolling back. "Stay awake," she commanded, removing his sodden coat. "What's your name?" "Zeke," he mumbled. "Zeke Quinn." "Well, Mr. Quinn, I'm Lilah Hayes, keeper of the Bentonville Light, and it appears I've just fished you out of the sea." His lips quirked into a weak smile. "Much obliged, Miss Hayes." As Lilah cleaned and bandaged his head wound, she studied his face. Despite the pallor and the grime, she could see he was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. His hands, which lay limp in his lap, were calloused and strong, a working man's hands. "What's a cowboy doing out in these waters?" she asked as she finished securing the bandage. "Not much cowboying at the moment," he replied with a grimace. "Was on a trading vessel, hired on in San Francisco, needed to get north." "The vessel, what was it called?" "The Prairie Star." Lilah's breath caught. "The 3-masted schooner. I saw it fighting the storm earlier today. It was heading straight for Murderer's Reef." Zeke nodded grimly. "Hit it dead on, split like kindling." His eyes suddenly widened. The others, there were 11 more men aboard. Lilah's expression said everything. She'd kept watch all day through the storm, and Zeke was the only soul she'd seen wash ashore. "I'm sorry." The realization seemed to drain what little strength he had left. His eyes drifted closed, and this time Lilah didn't try to keep him awake. He needed rest. She covered him with a thick woolen blanket and returned to the top of the lighthouse to tend the light. The storm continued to rage throughout the night. Every hour, Lilah checked on both the light and her unexpected guest. By morning, the worst of the storm had passed, though the skies remained leaden and threatening. Zeke slept through it all. His body desperately needed rest to recover from his ordeal. When he finally awoke the next afternoon, Lilah was preparing a simple stew from her dwindling supplies. "How long was I out?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. Lilah turned from the small stove. "Nearly a full day. How do you feel?" Zeke gingerly touched the bandage on his head. "Like I argued with the wrong end of a horse." "You're lucky to be alive," Lilah said, ladling stew into a bowl. "Most who meet murderers' reef don't live to tell the tale." "Seems I have you to thank for that," he replied, accepting the bowl with a nod of gratitude. As Zeke ate, Lilah explained her situation. The Bentonville Lighthouse was relatively isolated, with the nearest town being 15 miles south along the coast. Supplies came once a month by boat when weather permitted, and the lighthouse inspector visited quarterly to ensure all was in order. "You manage this place alone?" Zeke asked, glancing around at the immaculate interior of the keeper's quarters. "Since my father died 3 years ago," Lilah confirmed. "The lighthouse board doesn't know he's gone. They think he's still the keeper and I just assist. If they knew a woman was running things, they'd replace you," Zeke finished for her. Lilah nodded. "This lighthouse is all I have. It's my home, my responsibility. Quite a burden for one person." "It's not a burden when you love something," she replied simply. Over the next few days, as Zeke regained his strength, he learned more about the remarkable woman who had saved his life. Lilah Hayes had been born in the lighthouse 26 years earlier. Her mother had died of fever when Lilah was just 10, leaving her and her father to manage alone. From childhood, she had learned every aspect of lighthouse keeping, from cleaning the lenses to maintaining the logbooks to performing minor repairs. In turn, Lilah discovered that Zeke Quinn was 32, born and raised on a cattle ranch in Wyoming Territory. Following his parents' death 5 years earlier, he'd sold the struggling ranch and had been drifting ever since, taking work where he could find it: cattle drives, ranch hands, even a brief stint as a deputy in a small Montana town. "What were you heading north for?" Lilah asked one evening as they sat by the fire, the lighthouse beam sweeping automatically overhead. Zeke stared into the flames. "My uncle has a homestead near Seattle. Wrote that he's getting on in years and needs help. Figured it was time to put down roots again." "And now," he met her gaze. "Now I'm not sure what comes next. I've lost everything I owned in that shipwreck. My money, my papers, even my father's pocket watch." "You still have your life," Lilah reminded him. "That's more than the others got." The gravity of his survival weighed on him. "Yes. Thanks to you and your lighthouse." As Zeke recovered, he began to help with the daily tasks of maintaining the lighthouse. His experience on the ranch made him handy with tools and repairs, and Lilah found herself grateful for the assistance. The winter storms had taken a toll on the structure, and there were numerous small fixes needed that she hadn't been able to manage alone. Together, they replaced weathered boards on the outer walkway, repaired leaks in the roof of the keeper's quarters, and even reinforced the path down to the shore. Lilah was surprised at how quickly they fell into an easy rhythm of work and companionship. One evening, A week after his arrival, Zeke found Lilah in the lantern room, polishing the magnificent Fresnel lens that focused the light out to sea. The sunset painted the western sky in fiery hues, casting a golden glow over her features as she worked. "It's beautiful up here," he said, joining her on the narrow walkway that circled the light. Lilah smiled. "This is my favorite time of day, when the light first comes on and touches the water. I can see why." Zeke moved to stand beside her at the railing. "From up here, it feels like you can see forever." "Some days, when the air is clear, I believe I can," she replied. "Father used to say that's why lighthouse keepers are a peculiar sort. We spend our lives looking outward, watching for what might come." "And what are you watching for, Lilah Hayes?" She turned to find him studying her, his blue eyes intense in the fading light. "I'm not sure anymore," she admitted. "When Father was alive, we talked of traveling someday, seeing the places beyond the horizon. But now you're anchored here." "Yes, though I don't regret it. This lighthouse has saved countless lives." "Including mine," Zeke said softly. A comfortable silence fell between them as the last rays of sunlight disappeared and darkness claimed the sea. The powerful beam of the lighthouse swept over the water in steady, reassuring circles. "The monthly supply boat should arrive in 3 days," Lilah said eventually. "They can take you to Astoria, where you can arrange transport to Seattle." Zeke nodded, though his expression was unreadable. "I suppose I should be moving on." The thought of his departure left an unexpected hollow feeling in Lilah's chest. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to having another person to share meals and conversation with. The lighthouse would seem terribly empty without him. The following morning brought another storm, not as severe as the one that had claimed the Prairie Star, but enough to keep them confined to the lighthouse. Zeke spent the day examining the mechanism that rotated the light, fascinated by its engineering. "My father designed this modification himself," Lilah explained, pointing to a particular gear. "It allows the light to turn more smoothly, using less oil." "He was a clever man," Zeke commented. "He was. He taught me everything I know about keeping this light." Lilah ran her hand along the brass housing. "When I was a little girl, I thought the light was magic, how it could reach so far out to sea, guiding ships safely past the dangers." "Isn't it, though?" Zeke asked. "A different kind of magic, perhaps, the kind made by human hands and hearts." Lilah looked at him with surprise. Most men she'd known, the few who visited the lighthouse on official business, treated her father's innovations and her own knowledge with dismissive tolerance at best. Zeke seemed genuinely interested and impressed. "You have a poet's soul, Mr. Quinn," she said. He laughed. "Not many cowboys get accused of that." "I suspect you're not like many cowboys." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Lilah looked away first, suddenly conscious of how close they were standing in the confined space of the lantern room. "I should check on the storm," she said, moving to the windows. The sea below was a churning mass of white-capped waves. "It's getting worse." Zeke joined her at the window. "Will ships still try to navigate in this?" "Some will, the foolish ones or the desperate." Lilah frowned at the horizon. "That's why the light must never go out, especially in weather like this." As if the sea had heard her words, a distant shape appeared through the driving rain, the unmistakable silhouette of a ship struggling against the storm. "There," Zeke pointed. "Is that vessel in trouble?" Lilah grabbed her brass telescope and focused it on the ship. "It's a whaling ship, and yes, they're in serious trouble. They're being pushed toward the reef." For the next several hours they kept vigil in the lantern room, watching as the whaling ship fought the current and wind. Lilah maintained the light with meticulous care, adding oil and adjusting the flame to ensure maximum brightness. "Can't we do more to help them?" Zeke asked. frustration evident in his voice as the ship drifted ever closer to the deadly rocks. "We're doing what we can," Lilah replied. "The light is their guide. If they can see it clearly enough, they might be able to correct their course." As night fell, the storm intensified. The wind howled around the lighthouse with such force that the entire structure seemed to sway. Waves crashed against the rocks below with thunderous power. "I need to secure the supply shed," Lilah suddenly realized, starting toward the stairs. "The door was loose this morning." "I'll go," Zeke offered immediately. "No, it's too dangerous in this weather." "You don't know the path well enough," she argued. "Then we'll both go," he insisted. "Two are better than one in this kind of weather." Reluctantly, Lilah agreed. They donned oilskin coats and made their way carefully down the spiral staircase and out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked them off their feet as they fought their way to the small wooden shed 50 yards from the lighthouse. As Zeke had feared, the door was banging violently, threatening to tear from its hinges. Together, they managed to secure it with rope and additional bracing. They were soaked through despite the oilskins by the time they turned back toward the lighthouse. They had covered half the distance when a tremendous crash came from above. Lilah looked up in horror to see that a section of the railing around the gallery deck had torn loose and was hanging precariously. "The light," she gasped. "If that falls, it could damage the lantern room." Without hesitation, she began running toward the lighthouse, Zeke close behind. The loose section of railing was swinging wildly in the wind, threatening to break free entirely and crash through the glass of the lantern room. "I need to secure it," Lilah shouted over the storm as they reached the lighthouse door. "It's too dangerous," Zeke protested. "You can't go out on that gallery in this wind." "I have no choice," she replied firmly. "If that railing goes through the glass and damages the light or the lens, ships will die, including that whaler we spotted." She was already climbing the stairs, taking them two at a time. Zeke followed, arguing all the way, but Lilah's mind was made up. When they reached the lantern room, she grabbed a coil of rope and headed for the narrow door that led out to the gallery deck. "At least let me do it," Zeke said, trying to take the rope from her. Lilah shook her head. "I know this lighthouse better than you do, but I'll need your help." She quickly explained her plan. Zeke would secure one end of the rope inside the lantern room and feed it out to her as she made her way around the gallery to the damaged section. Once there, she would secure the loose railing as best she could until proper repairs could be made. "I don't like this," Zeke said as he tied the rope around her waist. "Neither do I," Lilah admitted, "but that light must keep burning." With that, she pushed open the door to the gallery and stepped out into the full fury of the storm. The wind threatened to tear her from the narrow walkway, but she gripped the remaining railing with white-knuckled determination and began to edge her way around the circumference of the tower. From inside, Zeke watched with his heart in his throat as the slight figure battled the elements. The rain made it difficult to see clearly, but he could tell when she reached the damaged section. For agonizing minutes, she worked to secure the loose railing, the wind whipping her clothing and hair wildly. Finally, she began making her way back toward the door. She was only a few feet away when a powerful gust caught her, momentarily lifting her off her feet. Zeke lunged forward, reaching through the doorway to grab her arm and pull her inside to safety. They collapsed on the floor of the lantern room, both breathing hard. Lilah's face was pale with cold and fear, but her eyes were bright with triumph. "It's secure," she gasped. "It should hold until the storm passes." Zeke stared at her in wonder. "You are either the bravest or the most foolhardy woman I've ever met." A smile tugged at her lips. Perhaps a bit of both. They became aware simultaneously that he still held her tightly against him, their faces inches apart. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then, slowly, Zeke reached up to brush a wet strand of hair from her cheek. "Lilah," he said softly. The moment was broken by a loud knocking from below. They pulled apart, startled. "Someone's at the door," Lilah said unnecessarily, rising quickly to her feet. "It must be survivors from the whaling ship." They hurried down the stairs to find 3 half-drowned sailors huddled at the lighthouse door. The men had managed to launch a lifeboat before their ship struck the rocks, and had fought their way to shore guided by the lighthouse beacon. "We saw your light," the captain explained as Lilah provided them with dry blankets and hot tea. "It was our only hope in the darkness." "The rest of your crew?" Zeke asked. "Still aboard when we left," the man replied grimly. "We were coming for help." "The ship is lodged on the rocks, but taking on water fast." Lilah and Zeke exchanged glances. "The nearest town with proper rescue equipment is Bentonville, 15 miles south," Lilah said. "But in this weather, traveling there would be nearly impossible." "Then those men are doomed," one of the sailors muttered. "Not necessarily," Zeke said thoughtfully. "How far offshore is the ship?" "Half a mile, maybe less," the captain answered. "And how many men are still aboard?" 12, including the first mate. Zeke turned to Lilah. "Is your father's old boat still in the boathouse?" She nodded. "Yes, but it's meant for calm waters and fishing, not rescue operations in a storm." "It might be our only option," Zeke argued. "We can't just leave those men to die." Lilah wanted to protest but knew he was right. The lighthouse was meant to prevent disasters, not just witness them. "The boathouse is on the lee side of the point," she said. "Somewhat sheltered from the worst of the wind, but it would still be incredibly dangerous." The decision made, they quickly formulated a plan. Zeke and the captain would take Lilah's father's boat and attempt to reach the stranded ship. The other 2 sailors, still weakened from their ordeal, would remain at the lighthouse with Lilah, who needed to maintain the light. "This is madness," Lilah said as she helped Zeke prepare. "You nearly drowned once already this week." "All the more reason I understand what those men are facing," he replied, pulling on an oilskin coat. Before he could step outside, Lilah caught his arm. "Zeke, please, be careful." He looked down at her, his expression softening. "Keep that light burning, lighthouse keeper. I'll find my way back to it, to you." With that, he and the captain disappeared into the storm. Lilah returned to the lantern room, her heart heavier than it had ever been. From her vantage point, she could see the distant glow of the stranded whaling ship and, much closer, the tiny lantern on her father's boat as Zeke and the captain fought their way through the churning seas. For hours, she maintained her vigil, keeping the lighthouse beam at its brightest. The 2 remaining sailors eventually succumbed to exhaustion and slept, but Lilah couldn't rest. Her eyes remained fixed on the distant lights, watching as the small boat reached the stranded ship and then began the arduous journey back, now heavily loaded with the rescued crew. Dawn was breaking when the first of the rescued men stumbled through the lighthouse door. They came in small groups, soaked and exhausted but alive. Lilah counted them as they arrived. 10, 11, 12, 13. And finally the captain, but no Zeke. "Where is he?" she demanded, grabbing the captain's arm. "Where is Mr. Quinn?" The captain's weary face told her everything before he spoke. "The last man was injured, couldn't climb into the boat on his own. Quinn went back to help him. They were both on deck when a wave hit, swept them overboard." Lilah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "And you didn't find them?" "We searched as long as we could, miss. But in those waters, in that storm." The captain shook his head sadly. "I'm sorry." Numb with shock and grief, Lilah climbed back to the lantern room. The storm was finally beginning to abate, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds. She extinguished the lamp, her movements mechanical, her mind refusing to accept what she'd been told. Zeke couldn't be gone. Not when she'd only just found him. Not when she was only beginning to understand what he might mean to her. For 3 days, Lilah searched the coastline, walking miles in each direction, scanning the shore for any sign of Zeke or the missing sailor. The rescued whalers, recovering in her small quarters, offered to help, but she preferred to search alone. It gave her time to come to terms with her grief and to hide her tears. On the evening of the 3rd day, the supply boat arrived from Bentonville. The captain, a gruff but kind-hearted man named Hargrove who had known Lilah since childhood, listened gravely to the tale of the shipwrecks and rescues. "I'm sorry about your friend, Lilah," he said. "The sea gives and takes as it pleases." "He wasn't just a friend," Lilah found herself saying. "He was," but she couldn't finish the thought. What had Zeke been to her? A shipwreck survivor, certainly. A helper around the lighthouse. But in the short time he'd been there, he'd become something more, something she hadn't fully recognized until it was too late. Captain Hargrove agreed to transport the rescued whalers to Astoria, where they could arrange passage home. As they prepared to depart the following morning, the first mate of the whaling ship approached Lilah. "Miss Hayes, we owe you and Mr. Quinn our lives," he said solemnly. "We've taken up a collection among the crew. It's not much, but we hoped it might help with the repairs to your lighthouse." He pressed a small pouch of coins into her hand. Lilah tried to refuse, but the man insisted. "It's the least we can do to honor Mr. Quinn's sacrifice." After the boat departed, taking with it the last connection to Zeke, Lilah found herself alone in the lighthouse that had always been her home but now felt emptier than ever before. She threw herself into work, making the repairs they had planned together, maintaining the light with even greater diligence than before. A week passed, then 2. Spring was advancing, bringing calmer seas and clearer skies. Lilah kept a journal of ships that passed safely. Imagining Zeke would have wanted to know that his sacrifice had meaning, that the light continued to save lives. On a clear April morning, Lilah was in the garden behind the lighthouse, tending to the vegetables she grew to supplement her supplies, when she heard the unmistakable sound of horses' hooves approaching. Visitors by land were rare, the coastal trail was difficult and seldom used. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun as a rider came into view. The man was still too distant to make out his features, but something about the way he sat in the saddle caused her heart to stutter. As the rider drew closer, Lilah remained rooted to the spot, afraid to believe what her eyes were telling her. It couldn't be, and yet, the horse stopped a few yards away. The rider, thin and weathered but unmistakably alive, swung down from the saddle. "I told you I'd find my way back to your light," Zeke Quinn said, his voice rough with emotion. Lilah couldn't speak, couldn't move. It was only when he took a step toward her, uncertainty crossing his face at her silence, that she broke from her trance and ran to him. His arms enfolded her, solid and real, as she pressed her face against his chest, hearing the strong, steady beat of his heart. "How?" she finally managed to ask, looking up at him through tears. "They said you were swept overboard." "I was," Zeke confirmed, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Along with the injured sailor. We were carried by the current south, as luck would have it, washed up on a beach nearly 5 miles from here. A family of homesteaders found us, took us in. The other fellow was badly hurt, still is recovering. I stayed until I was sure he'd pull through, then borrowed a horse to get back here." He paused. "To get back to you." Lilah touched his face, still not quite believing he was real. "I searched for you, every day." "I know you did." "The homesteader told me a woman from the lighthouse had been asking all along the coast if anyone had seen survivors." He covered her hand with his own. "Lilah, when I was in that water, fighting to keep my head above the waves, All I could think about was getting back to you. Your lighthouse saved me twice, she shook her head. The lighthouse is just a building. A tool. No, Zeke said firmly. It's more than that. It's a beacon of hope in the darkness, just like you. He took a deep breath. I've been drifting for years, Lilah. Never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. But these past weeks, even thinking I might never see you again, I knew I'd found the place I wanted to stay. If you'll have me. As what? Lilah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Assistant lighthouse keeper. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. That would be a start, though I was hoping for something more permanent, something that might convince the lighthouse board to let you keep running this place, even if they discover you're a woman. Understanding dawned on Lilah. Mr. Quinn, are you proposing a business arrangement or something else entirely? Both, he admitted. Though the something else is the more important part. I love you, Lilah Hayes. I think I started falling for you the moment I opened my eyes on that beach and saw you standing over me like some avenging angel. Lilah laughed, the sound mingling with her tears. And I thought you were the most troublesome piece of flotsam ever to wash up on my shore. And now? Zeke asked, suddenly serious again. Now I think you're the most valuable treasure the sea ever gave me, she replied. And yes, Zeke Quinn, I will marry you for business and for love. He kissed her then, there in the garden with the lighthouse standing tall behind them. And Lilah knew that, while she would always be a lighthouse keeper, guiding ships safely through dangerous waters, she had finally found her own safe harbor. The wedding took place 2 months later in the small church in Bentonville. The entire town turned out for the occasion, curious about the lighthouse keeper's daughter and her cowboy groom. Captain Hargrove gave the bride away, and the reception was held on the grounds of the lighthouse, with tables set up facing the sea. When they submitted their marriage certificate to the lighthouse board, along with a letter explaining the situation, they expected resistance. To their surprise, the board responded that while there were few female lighthouse keepers, there were precedents. Given Lilah's years of experience under her father's tutelage and her proven dedication during the recent disasters, they would allow the Quinns to continue as joint keepers of the Bentonville Light. Life settled into a new rhythm. Zeke proved as adept at lighthouse keeping as he had been at ranching, quickly learning the technical aspects of maintaining the light and developing innovations of his own. His experience with horses came in handy when they acquired 2 sturdy ponies to make the journey to town easier, and he built a small stable adjacent to the keeper's quarters. Lilah found that sharing her beloved lighthouse with someone who appreciated its importance made the work even more meaningful. Together, they expanded the garden, made improvements to the living quarters, and even constructed a small workshop where Zeke crafted furniture and Lilah experimented with new lens cleaning compounds. They kept a detailed logbook of ships aided, lives saved, and storms weathered. Each entry was a testament to their partnership and the vital service they provided. The Bentonville Light became known up and down the coast as one of the most reliable and well-maintained beacons, and ship captains often went out of their way to salute the lighthouse as they passed. A year after their wedding, on a stormy night reminiscent of the one that had first brought Zeke to her shore, Lilah gave birth to a son. They named him Thomas, after her father, and from his earliest days he was raised to understand the importance of the light and their responsibility to those who depended on it. As young Thomas grew, he was joined by a sister, Eleanor, and later another brother, James. The keeper's quarters, once so empty, now echoed with children's laughter. Lilah taught them to read using the lighthouse manuals and logbooks, while Zeke instructed them in riding, carpentry, and the ways of both land and sea. You ever regret it? Lilah asked Zeke one evening, 10 years after their wedding. They stood together in the lantern room, watching the beams sweep over the darkened water as their children slept below. Not going on to your uncle's homestead, settling instead for this isolated life. Zeke looked at her with the same intensity he had shown on the day he returned to her. Regret finding the love of my life. Regret raising our children in a place where they learn the value of service and responsibility every day. Regret doing work that matters. He shook his head. Not for a single moment. He pulled her close, both of them gazing out at the vast expanse of sea and sky. I was a ship without direction before I found you, Lilah, lost in a storm of my own making. You and this lighthouse gave me purpose again. A home. A family. We gave each other those things, Lilah corrected gently. I was just as adrift in my own way, anchored to this place but drifting in loneliness. The lighthouse continued to stand strong against the elements, a symbol of their enduring commitment both to each other and to those who depended on their vigilance. Each night as they lit the lamp, they remembered the storm that had brought them together and the love that had grown from that chance encounter. Years passed, and their children grew. Thomas, showing his mother's dedication and his father's practical skills, trained to become a lighthouse keeper himself. Elinor developed a passion for nursing, inspired by her parents' rescue work. And James, the youngest, inherited his father's wanderlust along with his mother's love of the sea, eventually joining the crew of a merchant vessel that regularly passed by the Bentonville Light. On each voyage, as his ship approached the familiar coastline, James would stand on deck and watch for the distinctive flash of his childhood home. His crewmates noticed his ritual and asked about it once. "That's not just any lighthouse," James explained with pride. "That's where my parents taught me that love is a beacon that guides us home, no matter how dark the night or how fierce the storm." And in the lantern room, now gray-haired but still strong, Lilah and Zeke would watch for James's ship, waving as it passed. Their love story, begun in a tempest's fury, continued to burn as steadily as the light they tended together, a guiding flame for all who knew them, a testament to finding safe harbor in the most unexpected of places. As the years continued to pass, Lilah and Zeke's reputation spread far beyond the Oregon coast. Maritime journals published accounts of their innovations in lighthouse keeping, and younger keepers sometimes traveled great distances to learn from them. The Bentonville Lighthouse became something of a landmark, not just for ships at sea but for the lighthouse service itself. When Thomas married the daughter of a ship captain who had once been saved by the Bentonville Light, the ceremony was held, as his parents had been, in the shadow of the lighthouse. The captain, misty-eyed, declared that his family and the Quinns were bound by more than marriage. They were bound by the light that had prevented tragedy and made joy possible. Elinor returned from her nursing studies in Portland to establish a small infirmary in the outbuilding that once served as Zeke's workshop. He had built a larger one closer to the stable. There, she treated minor injuries and illnesses among the scattered homesteaders along the coast, becoming nearly as well known and respected as her parents. And James, though his sailing took him to distant ports, always brought back stories and treasures for his family. His favorite gift was a powerful spyglass he presented to his parents on their 25th wedding anniversary, inscribed with the words, "To see each other clearly across any distance." When the lighthouse service began to modernize in the early 1900s, introducing automation and reducing the need for resident keepers, Lilah and Zeke were among the few granted special permission to remain in service past the usual retirement age. Their experience and dedication were too valuable to lose, officials determined. Things are changing, Zeke observed one evening in 1915 as they watched a steamship pass far offshore. At 69, his hair had turned completely silver, though he still stood straight and strong. Soon they won't need people like us to keep the lights burning. They'll always need people who care, Lilah replied. At 63, she remained as determined as ever, though she now used a cane on days when the old injury from a fall on the gallery steps troubled her. The methods may change, but the purpose remains. That purpose was tested one last time when, in the winter of 1916, a passenger steamer radioed that it was in distress off the coast during a particularly violent storm. Though both Lilah and Zeke were well past the age for such exertions, they maintained the light at its brightest through 3 days and nights of unrelenting weather. When Thomas arrived with a rescue party from Bentonville, he found his elderly parents still at their post, exhausted but unwavering. The steamer had managed to reach safer waters, its captain later crediting the unwavering beacon of Bentonville with guiding them through the worst of the storm. "You could have called for relief," Thomas scolded gently as he helped his father down from the lantern room. Zeke exchanged a glance with Lilah. "And miss our last great adventure as keepers. Not a chance, son." It was, indeed, their last major crisis as lighthouse keepers. The following spring, they finally accepted retirement, turning over the official duties to Thomas and his wife. Though they remained in residence in a comfortable cottage, Zeke had built on the lighthouse grounds years earlier in preparation for this day. From their cottage windows, they could still see the beams sweeping over the water each night. Sometimes, when the weather was fair, they would make the walk up to the lighthouse just to stand in the lantern room again, surrounded by memories of a lifetime of service. "Do you remember telling me once that lighthouse keepers spend their lives looking outward?" Zeke asked Lilah one evening as they sat on their cottage porch, watching the familiar flash of the light against the darkening sky. "I do," she replied, her hand finding his as it had countless times over their decades together. "You were right about that," he continued. "But what I didn't understand then, what I couldn't have known, was that sometimes, when you look outward long enough, you find what you need looking back at you." Lilah smiled, the years falling away from her face as she turned to the man who had washed up on her shore so many decades ago. "A ship in need of a lighthouse, and a lighthouse keeper in need of a purpose beyond the light itself," he finished, bringing her hand to his lips. Their story became legend along the coast, the lighthouse keeper who saved a cowboy from the sea, and the cowboy who helped her keep the light burning through the worst of storms. They lived to see their grandchildren, and even some great-grandchildren, each generation hearing the tale of how love had found a way to shine through the darkest night. When Zeke passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 84, Lilah continued to live in their cottage for another 3 years. Though her body grew frail, her mind remained sharp, and she delighted in sharing her vast knowledge of lighthouse keeping with her descendants and the occasional maritime historian, who made the journey to Bentonville specifically to meet her. On her 86th birthday, surrounded by family, Lilah looked out at the lighthouse that had been the center of her life and smiled contentedly. "It will outlast us all," she observed, "and that's as it should be." That night, after the celebration, Lilah Hayes Quinn climbed the lighthouse steps one final time, accompanied by Thomas, who understood his mother's need for this pilgrimage. In the lantern room, she placed her hand on the great lens that had guided so many to safety. "Thank you," she whispered, though whether to the lighthouse itself or to the fate that had used it to bring Zeke into her life, even she couldn't have said. Lilah passed away in her sleep that night, and the family laid her to rest beside Zeke on the small plot of land near the cottage, where wildflowers grew in abundance during the spring and summer months. On their shared headstone, beneath their names and dates, was a simple inscription: "Keepers of the light, guardians of the shore, forever guiding each other home." The Bentonville Lighthouse still stands today, now fully automated but no less vital to maritime safety. Visitors who tour the historic structure are often told the story of Lilah Hayes and Zeke Quinn, the lighthouse keeper and the cowboy who found in each other the safe harbor they never knew they were seeking. And some say that on nights when the storms rage fiercest along the Oregon coast, if you look closely at the lantern room, you might glimpse two figures silhouetted against the light, still keeping watch, still guiding ships to safety, still finding in each other the love that burns as steadily as the beacon they tended together for so many years. Their legacy lives on not just in the lighthouse that bears a small plaque commemorating their service, but in the lives they touched, the ships they saved, and the family they created. Most of all, it endures in the example they set of how love, like a lighthouse, can guide us through the darkest nights and bring us safely home,